House bill as amended be read a third time. Statutory pay-go statement be read if needed. And the bill as amended be passed with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object.
Republican Leader.
I would ask consent that the request be modified to strike the last paragraph, and further that it also be in order for a second amendment, the text of which will be at the desk, and is the President's small business tax hike. Further, that it be considered under the same terms of my amendment, and that after the vote on that amendment, the Senate proceed to a vote on the McConnell-Hatch amendment as the original request provided for.
Is there objection to the
Mr. President, reserving the right to object.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, the President's bill is the one that's before this body that I ask consent on. We have a statement of administrative policy. It's the President's bill, the one we would vote on. So I respectfully object to my friend's suggested modification.
Heard to the modification. Is there objection to the original request by Majority Leader?
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
My friend has objected to the last paragraph in my request, and he's asked consent to add a third provision. I've objected to the third provision. He's objected to the last paragraph. I would be willing to renew my consent minus the last paragraph, which begins with the word finally and ends with the word debate.
Is there objection to the new unanimous consent request? Without objection, so ordered.
So, Mr. President, the vote will occur at 4 o'clock today on these two amendments. I appreciate very much the Republican leader allowing us to arrive at the point where we are. And I would tell everyone that the time until 4 o'clock is evenly divided, approximately an hour for each side. Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent that if there are quorum calls between now and 4 o'clock, that the time be equally divided between the two sides.
Without objection, so ordered.
I would note the absence of quorum.
The clerk would call the roll of the Senate.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the call of the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection, the senator from Indiana is recognized.
Mr. President, I'd like to talk about two things here briefly and also yield to my colleague for some remarks. First of all, while it's beyond our jurisdiction here, and perhaps it's a little bit out of a line for me to talk about this, I'm just urging the Congress, and specifically in this case the House of Representatives, to follow this body in passing the Farm Bill. And I do so for a number of reasons, even though I had some problems with the Farm Bill, and I fully understand the issues there that those that believe that those policies that directly affect agriculture are being subordinated to a bill which incorporates about 80% of that bill for federal food assistance. And these are nutrition issues which, of course, are related to agriculture. By the same token, it is a federal program that is significantly different than what the Farm Bill is designed to accomplish. So about 20% of that bill affects the farmers in our area, and the other 80% goes to a federal welfare type of program for providing food stamps and other nutrition assistance. And so I'm hoping that the House, particularly in light of the fact that we are suffering a significant drought, probably the worst drought since 1950 according to the weather records, and getting worse all the time. The temperatures have been in the low hundreds all across the Midwest, the breadbasket of America, where we produce most of our grain and feedstock, and cornfields and soybean fields and other pastures are burning up with blazing sun in the hundreds of degrees every day and no water falling from the skies. And so this drought is seriously impacting my state, but also a number of Midwestern states and essentially the states that produce the bulk of our agricultural products. And they affect not only needed crops to feed, provide feedstock, but also that support our ethanol program and a number of other programs. And so it's a dire situation. And so I'm hoping that the House can resolve its issues and move forward. There are a number of provisions in this Farm Bill that provide relief to farmers and ranchers suffering from this drought. And those are expiring. And so it's important that we pass this bill, we get it past both houses of Congress and into conference, resolved and signed by the President before these provisions expire. And so I'm urging my colleagues in the House where I once served to help with this by moving forward on this Farm Bill. Now, the other point I want to make, and I'll yield to my friend in a second, I just want to introduce this, is that we are about to face, we just learned from our leadership, we are about to enter into a short amount of debate before we vote on a motion to address taxes. And this also directly affects our agriculture community, and we'll explain why, but I'd like to yield to my colleague here from Mississippi for some comments in this regard.
Well, I appreciate what my friend has said about the drought, and much of my state at the last minute escaped it, but I happened to be in the state of Missouri in the past few days and saw the terrible drought conditions there. I can't think of a worse time with our farm community being devastated by this drought to talk about a huge tax increase on our agriculture community, particularly in the form of the estate tax. And I just learned a remarkable thing, and I would ask my colleagues if this is the state of the bill that we will now be voting on at 4 this afternoon, the result of this legislation would be to take the estate tax back up to 55% on all of the value of an estate over $1 million. This would be a devastating tax increase. And I honestly do not believe that the American people understand that this is the effect of the legislation that our friends from the majority side have brought forward. But if this bill is passed the way it is currently configured, that would be the result. We would go back to the old law, 55% tax on all the value of these southern and midwestern farms, of any small businesses across the country, would go up to 55% over values of $1 million. It's an unthinkable result, and I really, frankly, wouldn't be surprised if the phones across the street in our offices are ringing off the wall at this result. I've asked my friend from South Dakota if I have misunderstood the effect of this legislation.
Mr. President, if I might respond to my colleague from Mississippi and from Indiana, Senator from Mississippi is absolutely right. The proposal that we will vote on is presented by the Democrats today would allow the death tax exemption to go back down to $1 million. That's the pre-2001 level, and apply a 55% tax rate on top of that. Now, just to give you an example of how that might work in a state like mine, I represent South Dakota. The average size farm in my state is a little under 1,400 acres, and if you look at the average the value per acre of land and multiply it by the size of the average farm, you're talking about an average farm between $2 and $2.5 million in value. So you could be talking about, this is average, I mean, we got a lot of farms that would be impacted in a much more significant way than this, but you're talking about then subjecting about $1.5 million of that farm's value to a 55% tax rate. And 84% of the value of farm assets, according to USDA, is in real estate. So they're land rich but cash poor. So what happens? Well, when the IRS comes calling after someone passes away and says, well, your farm's worth this amount, we're going to assess a 55% tax, they say, we can't pay that. We don't have the cash. Yes, we have it in land. So what do? They sell the land. They sell assets. They sell equipment to pay the IRS. And here we are trying to promote intergenerational transfer of farms and ranches to keep family farming in this country as part of the backbone of our economy. And this is the absolute opposite of what we ought to be encouraging if we want to have policies that encourage family farms and ranches to stay in the family. So having a confiscatory tax like this that would apply a 55% tax to assets above $1 million is going to have a crushing impact on farms and ranches in my country, and I would submit to my colleague from Mississippi as well.
And if our friend from Indiana would continue to yield for just a moment, because this is his time and I don't want to intrude, this is also the same effect on mom and pops, on a family business, may have been in the family for generations. We're going to impose a 55% confiscatory tax. I am just speechless that this bill has now gotten to the point where it brings us back to the early punitive estate tax rates, which we've gotten away from.
Again, to my colleague from Mississippi and again on the senator from Indiana's time. But just to put this in perspective, the proposal in the Democrat bill, which would take the exemption back down to $1 million and raise the top rate to 55%, would apply to 24 times the numbers of farms and ranches as does current law. In other words, it increases by 24 times the number of family farms and ranches that would be impacted by the estate tax relative to where we are under current law. And as the senator from Mississippi pointed out, lots of mom and pop businesses, 13 times the number of small businesses would now be subject to the death tax, as is the case with current law. And so, you know, if you look at the impact of this, certainly in farm and ranch country, I see our colleague from Kansas, Senator Moran, is here, who also represents a lot of farmers and ranchers very much like those in my state of South Dakota. This is profoundly impactful. I mean, this would have a dramatic impact, completely adverse, be very, very negative impact on farm and ranch company, but I also would argue, as the senator from Mississippi pointed out, on a lot of mom and pop small businesses in this country.
Well, I thank my colleagues for joining in on this. They've made their points tonight that I think outline the fact that many of us are stunned with a proposal that is being brought forward for a vote today to proceed on this bill, which incorporates a change in the tax law to impose a 55% tax if you die on all the work and all the profits and all the investment that you've made throughout your lifetime, which, by the way, you have paid taxes on over and over and over. The government now just can never get enough. So the President is now proposing, and is being led here by the Democrats in the Senate, of raising the death tax from 35%, its current level, to 55%. And let me personalize this for just a moment. We have some very close friends who throughout generations have been handing the farm down from one generation to another. And they have suffered through the hard times, the droughts, the hailstorms, the tornadoes. They've also benefited from the good times. When the rains have come, the soil is good, and the yield is good. And yet right now they are suffering in a way that they haven't in more than half of a century, with this drought that just is unrelenting all across this country. And it takes in almost the entire farm belt of the Midwest and upper Midwest, where most of our grain and products are grown. And at a time like this, to bring forth a piece of legislation which basically says, well, not only are you being nailed by the weather, and we obviously can't do anything about that except to provide some basic form of financial help and relief to get through this particular time, and that's what I was talking about earlier. But we're going to nail you with a tax that when you die will basically prevent you from passing on your business or your farm to the next generation. And as I said, to personalize it, we have some dear friends, more than one couple, and I've talked to people throughout Indiana where the pride in holding their ground as part of their extended family, covering more than one and two generations, and the work that they have put in order to preserve that hand-down to their children and then to their grandchildren, now goes up in flame. Because when they die, they are now have imposed, if their farm is valued at more than $1 million, a 55% tax on the value of everything over that $1 million. And people say, well, okay, they're millionaires. No, they're not millionaires. They are sitting on property that might be valued that. They might be losing money, and for sure this year they're going to lose money. They're not going to make any money this year because they've had to plow their corn under, because it hasn't gotten the rain and moisture that it needs, and it's not going to grow. And we don't know yet the extent of this disaster. And yet to preserve that within the family and hope for better years to come, those won't happen. Because they're going to, as the senator from North Dakota said, they're going to have to value their land. The IRS will value their land at a price which causes them, the only way in which they can pay for that is to sell their assets. Why in the world, at a time of an economic drift back into potentially recession, this country is not in good economic shape. Compared to Europe, we're in better shape, but if you look at the numbers, they're not trending the right way. And why at a time like this would you walk onto the floor of the United States Senate and put a bill up that it's going to raise taxes on people who are already suffering from 35% to 55%? How high does it have to go? How many taxes have to be imposed on the American people before they say, that's enough? Why don't you clean up your spending process back in Washington so we don't have to pay so much in taxes to cover all that you're doing there? I know my colleagues would like to continue to respond to this, and I want to turn to my friend and colleague.
If I could make one point, because I know my friend from Kansas wants to join in here. This could only hurt job creation among small business people and small farmers. And I can't imagine at a time, we've had 42 months of unemployment over 8%, the longest in peacetime within modern history. And to put this tax on farms that create jobs and small businesses that create jobs, which is where most of our new jobs come from, is just unthinkable. I can't imagine that it would do anything, if it were signed into law, as the President wants to do, other than make that 8.2% unemployment rate go even higher.
Well, I'd like to turn to my colleague from Kansas. One of the I didn't name the family, but one of the families that's very close to us because my wife grew up with her very best lifetime friend and married a farm boy from Kansas. And they now run a farm out in Norton, near Norton, Kansas. And we speak with them regularly. And so we have, even though we're city people, we have learned from them the sacrifice that goes into maintaining a farm, the suffering that goes from the whims of the weather, the prices of the crops, and we've seen them struggle and struggle, and this obviously will not be a good year. But this is a farm that's been passed down now to the third generation. They own a lot of land, but as you know, in Kansas, you got to own a lot of land because you don't begin to have the soil to get the rainfall that we get in the Midwest, and so your planning is different. And so I know that this is a situation that ends the dream that has been passed down from generation to generation, because if on the death of the current owners of the farm, the tax on that will force them to sell their land.
Mr. President, I thank the senator from Indiana for yielding. Yesterday in Norton, Kansas, the temperature was 118. I read the story where they just watched the thermometer go up degree by degree by degree. And it's now been more than a month in which the temperatures in our state have exceeded 100 degrees. It's been certainly more than a month in which we've had little or no rainfall most places across our state. The drought is real, and it puts people in a different mood. There's always optimism on a farm. There's always optimism on a ranch. My small business men and women in Kansas are optimistic that when they get up and go to work every day, that it's going to be a better day at the end of the day, and tomorrow is going to be better than this day, and next month is better than this month. But I can tell you with the weather pattern that we have had in the Midwest this summer, the optimism begins to disappear. And today we come to learn just one more thing that is now going to be oppressive to farmers and ranchers and small businessmen and women in Kansas and across the country. You know, we started this year with a discussion by something the Department of Labor did. Proposed rules to restrict a young person from working on a family farm. We've had a series of regulations from the Environmental Protection Agency and others that make it so difficult for a small business person or a farmer to succeed. And now we learn today the proposal that we're going to revert back to days gone by in which a $1 million estate will be subject to a marginal tax rate of 55%. It has been a series of things in the last year from this administration and this Congress that sends a message to farmers and ranchers in Kansas and small businessmen and women in our state and across the country that your value, your work ethic, your efforts will not be rewarded. Not only will they not be rewarded, but they will be, we will discourage them. We will not reward the kinds of things that you do each and every day, the things that you're optimistic about. And the senator from Indiana is so correct in this sense that every farmer and rancher I know, at the end of the day, their goal is to see that they've done the things that day, not only to feed and clothe and provide energy to the world, but to see that they have a farming operation, a ranching operation that is of the nature that it can be passed on to the next generation of Kansas farmers and ranchers. It is the sense of satisfaction that comes in a farmer's life when the son and daughter that follows them has the ability. Nothing is easy in agriculture. There's not a thing any day that's easy on a farm or ranch in Kansas or across the country. You're right. Our weather patterns, our soil conditions, it takes a lot of drive and effort. It takes stamina and discipline to survive. And much of the day is spent trying to survive, and here we see just a series of things as we arrive today to discover that we want to increase the tax upon those people who work hard every day and whose goal it is to tell their sons and daughters, I have a farm or I have a ranch that can be yours someday, and you can take over where I left off. And why is that so important? Because that's the way historically, traditionally in our state, farming has occurred. It's a family farming operation, and it's passed down from great-grandparents to grandparents to parents to children to grandchildren, and there's great pride and satisfaction that comes from that. And we are here today to make certain that the federal government doesn't create one more obstacle toward that goal of making certain that the next generation of Kansans have the opportunity to work, to earn a living, to feed the world on their own family farm or ranch. And it is so surprising to me that there would be anyone who believes that these individuals, these business operations, farms or small businesses, ought to be singled out and treated in a way that discourages them from accomplishing that American dream of passing that farm and ranch on to kids and grandkids. And I hope that our colleagues today see the light and understand how important this is in rural America. And not only is it important in rural America, but what happens in our part of the country determines whether or not we have the ability to provide food and fiber for the country and for the globe.
Well, I want to thank my colleague from Kansas, and I know my colleague from North Dakota has arrived, having heard from my colleague from South Dakota, and I got the Dakotas mixed up. I apologize to Senator Thune. Well, whether it's the family that my wife grew up with and knew, or whether it's a family down in Posey County, Indiana, that the farm family that drew their neighbors together for a meeting just a few months ago, or whether it's families or business owners of small businesses all across the state of Indiana that I've talked to repeatedly, who basically saying, I resent being called rich by the president, who says they need to pay more in taxes. We've been working our tails off for generations, and we've been paying our taxes faithfully for the profits that we've made, the years that we have made profits. And yet we're being classified as some type of an elite group that's not paying their fair share. You know, when we look back and we read statistics like 47% of Americans aren't paying any income taxes. And we're those out creating jobs, building a business, sometimes good years, sometimes bad years, but over a lifetime, there's value added to that business. But that value is in machines, it's in buildings, it's in land in terms of farmers. And that gets valuated when we die at a level which means that we can't pass it on, we can't afford to pass it on to other generations, and we have to sell it because the federal government, having taxed us all of our life on the profits that we've made, the income taxes, the Social Security contributions, the Medicare contributions, the sales taxes, the personal property taxes, the car taxes, the boat taxes if you have a boat, the excise taxes, the liquor taxes, the beer tax, the sales tax, on and on and on you go. You know, it's not just the income tax. We are just being taxed there's just not another tax that government doesn't want to impose on the American people. And so now to come at a time of economic distress when the United States is the only country struggling to stay ahead and perhaps lead the world back into economic growth, at a time when we are seeing some signs of potential double-dip recession facing us, the news in the last few days has been dramatically bad. Why either party would want to bring a bill to the floor of the United States Senate and say, you're not paying enough. If you own a small business or you own a farm, you're not paying enough. So we think 55% is a fair rate. 55% if you die after you've paid taxes all your life going to the federal government, which is bloated, duplicative. The bureaucracy here is out of control, and Congress hasn't lived up to its responsibility to take any kind of sensible fiscal measures that will get us back on track in terms of balancing our budget and not spending more than we take in. Throughout all the efforts that took place throughout 2011 and some in 2012, we still have not come up with that program, with that budget arrangement, which will put us on the path to fiscal health. And what is the response from the other side? The response is, let's impose another tax. And so at 4 o'clock today, members are going to come down here and vote in terms of whether they want to impose a 55% death tax on people who are already being taxed to death. I'd be happy to, actually, Mr. President, since I need to leave the floor, I will cease here, but then I'm sure my colleague wants to ask his own recognition.
Senator from South Dakota.
Mr. President, I think we have about a half an hour left. Is that correct?
The Senator is correct.
Okay. And I would just ask that unanimous consent that we be able to enter into a discussion for the balance of that time.
Without objection.
And I would say to my colleague, I thank the Senator from Indiana for his very astute observations about the impact of these taxes on hardworking men and women in this country. And I would say to my colleague from North Dakota, who's now here, and the Senator from Kansas, both of whom represent very rural states, that this is not an issue that is inconsequential. A lot of people think that people who have $1 million of assets are rich. But as I said earlier, in most farm and ranch operations, the value of that, or 80% of the value of that, is in real estate. And so they may be land rich but cash poor. And so when you talk about imposing a tax of this size on hardworking farmers and ranchers in this country, you really are getting at the very heart of, as the Senator from Kansas pointed out, their ability to transfer that farm or ranch operation to the next generation. And that's really what's at stake here. And in North Dakota, the Senator from North Dakota is here, and the farmland in North Dakota is very similar to that what we have in South Dakota, except that they have energy. There's, they found oil in a few places in North Dakota, which drives those land values up even higher. We would like to see some of that in South Dakota. But either way, in either of the Dakotas or in Kansas, you've seen land values go up the past few years, and it takes a bigger operation to make it work, to survive in modern agriculture. And so these size of these operations, in many cases, exceed by multiples the amount, the $1 million exemption that would be allowed for under the Democrat proposal, and everything above that, as has been said, would be taxed at 55%, which would be absolutely disastrous for American agriculture today. And that's on top of the other taxes. This proposal also raises taxes on about 1 million small businesses who employ about 25% of the American workforce. It raises taxes on capital gains and dividends, and then it puts this death tax back into place with a $1 million exemption. As I said earlier, if you look at the number of people who would be subject to and covered by the death tax today, this proposal would increase those people subject to whom the death tax would apply 24 times, a 2,400% increase in the number of people who would be subject to the death tax, according to the Joint Committee on Taxation. That's the group that studies these issues here and that looks at the impacts of tax policy. According to the Joint Committee on Taxation, 24 times more farmers and ranchers would be subject to the death tax than are subject to it today, and 13 times more small businesses. That's the scale of the proposal that the Democrats have put forward. And so I would say to my colleague from North Dakota, my neighbor, that I assume as he talks to farmers and ranchers in his state, he gets the same sort of feedback that I do in visiting with people in South Dakota, and that is they are very, very concerned about what would be a huge tax increase, so to speak, when someone passes on and tries to pass that operation on to the next generation.
No, that's exactly right, and I'm very pleased to be here with my esteemed colleague from South Dakota as well as my esteemed colleague from Kansas. And I really want to commend Senator Coates from Indiana for the strong and important points that he made here as part of this discussion here on the Senate floor. And it's certainly about this vote that we'll have on the tax code, its impact on farming and in small business across this country, but also Senator Coates made a very, very important point here just a minute ago, and that's with this drought, we already have farmers and ranchers, our producers, in a situation where they face difficult times because of the drought. And so I join him in calling on our House colleagues to act on the Farm Bill. I think it's very, very important that we pass the Farm Bill as we have here in the Senate. I had opportunity to work on that Farm Bill with Senator Thune from South Dakota and others. We passed a good package in the Senate. The House Ag Committee has passed a good package, a good farm package as well. We need that to pass the House floor. We need to get it into conference and get a farm bill done for our producers. I think that's just incredibly important always because good farm policy benefits every American. We have the highest quality, lowest cost food supply in the world, thanks to our farmers and ranchers, and particularly now, with our farmers throughout the country looking at drought, it is very, very important that they know that we have a sound farm program in place both now and for the future. And as regards this vote here in the Senate today, whether it's the good senator from Indiana, from Kansas, from South Dakota, and others, this is incredibly important. We're looking at a bill that essentially is a plan that's been put forward by President Obama that will raise income taxes, that will raise taxes on capital gains, and that will raise the estate tax. I was down here this morning, and others have been talking about the impact on small business that those tax increases will have when we've got 8.2% unemployment. We've had 8% unemployment for more than 40 straight months. And to a large degree, people are focused on the increase in the income tax and its impact on small business. But this impact from estate tax, from the death tax, is a big deal. And people need to understand what the ramifications are if that estate tax is increased. And they understand it very well in our states because of the case we're making right here. Look at how this affects our farmers and ranchers. You're talking about going from a situation where when a farmer or rancher looks to pass on that farm or ranch, right now they're taxed from an estate tax standpoint on the amount above $5 million. And then it's at a 35% rate. But what would this plan that's being put forward today do, that's being put forward essentially by the President, by the other side of the aisle? It would change that to go back to a $1 million, anything over $1 million is subject to estate tax, and then it's taxed at a 55% rate. So just do the math, right? And I think that's the point that the good senator from South Dakota and Kansas and others have been making is it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. In other words, that family can't borrow enough money to pay off the estate tax and keep the farm because they can't afford to pay back that level of debt. The farming operation won't sustain it. The ranching operation won't sustain it. You can't borrow that much money to try to keep the farm and the family because you can't afford to pay the debt. As a business enterprise, it can't service the debt. So what happens? The only alternative is to sell the farm. So now here you have farmers who've been farming for generations. Their father, their grandfather, grandmother, mother, relatives, all the way back, and now their kids. Their kids are farming with them now. Their children are involved in that farming enterprise, and they want to continue farming. But that's not going to be an option because they're not going to be able to afford the estate tax. So this is exactly what we're talking about when we talk about how raising taxes will have a detrimental impact on our economy. We've talked about it in terms of small business. We've talked about it in terms of the income tax. We've talked about the ramification on capital gains tax. But I think this demonstrates how clearly it truly has an impact across this country on all small businesses. Because I think all of us, from our states and from many states, they know these farm families. They know it's not just a job or a vocation, it's a way of life. And it's a way of life that those families have been counting on. And I want to make one further point before I turn the podium over to my esteemed colleague. And that is that these farm families, or any other small business, when you look at the estate tax, keep in mind that they're passing assets. But their entire life, they've been paying taxes. They've been paying income taxes, sales tax, property tax. They've been paying taxes all the way along. So it's not like they're just handing this stuff on to the next generation without paying tax because they're not paying that death tax. They've been paying taxes on it all their lives, and not just one or two taxes, multiple taxes. So this property is taxed their entire life. They work their entire life to pay those taxes, and then they face a death tax that would force them to sell the business? That's not right. And you know what? That's not right if it's a farm or a ranch or, frankly, any other kind of small business in this country, because this country is about small business. That's the backbone. Small business is the backbone of our economy. It is the backbone of this country. And that's exactly what we're dealing with. That's why we've put forward an option, and we encourage our colleagues to support an option that will continue the current tax rates, that will not raise tax rates, and then we work on extending those current tax rates for a year, and we engage in pro-growth tax reform. We close loopholes, and we get more revenue from economic growth, from a growing, more vibrant economy that puts people back to work rather than from higher taxes. With that, I yield the floor back to
Well, I'd say
colleague from South Dakota.
I appreciate the remarks of our colleague from North Dakota who understands this issue very well, representing a state that is composed largely of family farms and ranches and small businesses. It's similar to my state of South Dakota, similar to Senator Moran's state in Kansas. We share not only a lot of commonalities in terms of how we make our living, but just in the kind of people, the quality, the hardworking, the backbone, as you said, of our country. And there's a work ethic in the land, out in people who are involved in agriculture, that really is, you hope, gets rewarded. And one of the ways that that gets rewarded is when somebody works very, very hard all their life, and that's really true in agriculture. There are very few jobs in agriculture that are easy. It is a hard way to make a living. The men and women who are involved in production agriculture have certainly, in my view, among the best work ethics in the country, and you want to see that hard work rewarded. And one of the ways that you hope that it gets rewarded is when it comes time, when you pass on, to be able to allow that operation to be handed off to the next generation so they too can benefit from that hard work and build that enterprise, that operation, and grow the family farm in a way that is good for our economy generally, and certainly good for the economy in places like North Dakota, South Dakota, and Kansas. And that's why a proposal like this is so devastating, because you are subjecting, as I said, 24 times more farms and ranches in this country to the death tax than are currently exposed to it under current law. And so this is a dramatic increase in the number of folks who would be impacted by the death tax, obviously a significant increase in the amount that people were going to be forced to pay when the time comes. And we, I think, at a time when we are facing unemployment now for 41 months, consecutive months over 8%, 23 million Americans either unemployed or underemployed. Some people, 5.4 million Americans who've been unemployed for a long period of time. The one thing we don't need in the middle of this kind of an economy is a big fat tax increase. And that's what the Democrat proposal does, not just on the estate tax, but also the marginal income tax rates going up on small businesses on January 1st. There will be almost 1 million businesses who are impacted by higher rates, who I should say, employ 25% of the workforce in this country, as well as increase in taxes on investment, on capital gains and dividends. So a big fat tax increase in the middle of a very fragile economy is the exact wrong prescription. And I would hope, as the senator from North Dakota suggested, that our colleagues on both sides will support the alternative that we will put forward, which will extend the rates for all Americans so that not any American is faced with higher taxes come January 1 of this year. I think it would be devastating for our economy to do that, certainly be devastating to the family farms and ranches in places like the Midwest. And I know my colleague from Kansas understands very well, because he represents the same kind of people that we do in the Dakotas. They're hardworking. All they want to know is that they have an opportunity to be able to benefit from that hard work, hopefully pass it on to the next generation when the time comes.
Mr. President, I'm pleased that the senator from North Dakota joined us, because I think he made a very valid point, something that I should have explained better. It's not just the fear of having to pay more taxes, but it's the reality you don't have the income to pay the tax, therefore requiring the sale of the assets, the sale of the farm machinery and equipment, the sale of the land, the sale of the cattle. And so while no one wants to pay more taxes, in this case, it is even more onerous in that you have value to assets. You have some wealth in the land and the equipment and the cattle, but never the sufficient income to pay the tax, and therefore the sale of those assets is required to pay the tax man, and therefore you don't have those assets that I was talking about earlier to pass on to your children and grandchildren. So this is not just about, I already pay enough taxes, I don't want to pay anymore, I can't afford anymore. This is the reality that I don't have the ability at all to come up with the income, unless, as the senator from North Dakota says, I go to the bank and borrow the money, but then I don't have the cash flow to repay the loan, and therefore I sell the property. And this, it comes at a time when many Kansans, farmers, and others would complain about how business and agriculture keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. The reality is we would love to have those farming operations, that family-sized farming scale that's so important to the cultural and economic vitality of communities across Kansas and across America. But because we have laws like the state tax, we sell those assets to bigger entities who can better afford, and we reduce the number of family farms that most of us believe are so important to who we are as Americans, and certainly so important to the economy and the cultural nature of rural America. And this comes at a time in which I've heard the discussion here on the floor today about the Farm Bill. And I know that my colleagues, the senator from South Dakota, the senator from North Dakota, have encouraged passage of a Farm Bill by the entire Congress. But this Farm Bill, let me remind you, is a reduction in Farm Bill spending only really on the side of production agriculture, of family farms across Kansas, a reduction in the amount of money available under the Farm Bill of $23 billion. And farmers in Kansas tell me they're willing to take their so-called hit to help reduce the country's fiscal condition. We're willing to take the $23 billion out of farm programs, but don't do other things to us that eliminate or reduce our ability to earn a living. And so here comes Congress, just a few weeks after we pass a Farm Bill, reducing the amount of money available for farm programs by $23 billion, saying, oh, let's do something else damaging to agriculture, to farmers and ranchers. Let's impose an estate tax in which the threshold is $1 million and the marginal rate is 55%. So it goes back contrary to what those farmers say, which is we'll take our hit, we'll contribute to getting this country's fiscal house back in order, but let us have the opportunity under a free enterprise system to succeed. And now we have one more handicap, one more hurdle toward accomplishing that. And finally, let me say I was on the Senate floor yesterday talking about this issue and particularly talking about a tax system. We need dramatic reform in our tax code. The idea that we would be extending the current tax law for the foreseeable future, we ought to be, this Congress, this President ought to be serious about scrapping the tax code and starting over with something much different. I spoke yesterday in favor of the fair tax, but regardless of what the conclusion is, we ought to have a simpler, fairer, more understandable tax code, and we ought to have the circumstance in which most taxpayers don't have to seek professional advice to figure out what it is they owe, or to spend their whole time as a farmer, a rancher, or a business person trying to figure out what do I do today that will have a positive or negative consequence upon the tax bill at the end of the year. We Americans spend a huge amount of time, a significant amount of money, in which we pay professionals to advise us how to avoid paying taxes. We desperately need a whole new tax code that is fairer, simpler, much more straightforward and understandable, so that we spend our time growing the economy as compared to spending our time trying to figure out how to manipulate the tax code and in the process lose our individual liberties and freedoms, because we're all about trying to make certain that we comply with the tax code as compared to determining what's in the best interest of us as citizens, us as individuals, as family members, and us as business owners. So while it's important that we point out the onerous nature of the estate tax and what is about to happen here in a vote in about an hour, we ought to remind ourselves that there's a much more important goal than this Congress, this President have been willing to address, and that is scrap this code and get something that makes sense to the American people, that's understandable, affordable, and that pays the necessary amounts to fund those programs required for us to be a successful country. I would yield to the senator from South Dakota.
The senator from Kansas, I too look forward to working with him on fundamental tax reform, because that is at the essence, that is really what we need to do to get the economy turned around. I think you would see tremendous economic growth. I think you would see our economy unleashed if we would reform our tax code in a way that broadens the tax base, lowers the rates. The senator from Kansas talked about the fair tax. That's certainly another proposal out there that many people support. But in any event, we do need a fundamental tax reform. And it'd be nice if when we do that, we do away with the death tax completely. But that being said, what's being proposed here today, as we've all pointed out, is something that in many cases, in places like Kansas and South Dakota, and our colleague from Wyoming, Senator Barrasso, is now here, who represents a rural state, a state where you've got a lot of folks with big expanses of land, is there are many people in agriculture who are land rich and cash poor. Senator from Kansas pointed out, when you have an operation that exceeds that $1 million threshold that's being proposed in the Democrat tax plan, and then everything above that in terms of the value of your assets is taxed at that top marginal rate of 55%, then you are, in many cases, having to sell pieces of your operation in order to pay the IRS, or worse yet, going to the bank to borrow money, in which case you may not be able to repay it. But this creates all kinds of problems for people who are involved day-to-day in production agriculture when it comes to keeping that operation in the family. And so I appreciate the senator from Kansas' astute observations and his insights based upon his experience with the people that he represents. And I, too, look forward to the day when we are debating fundamental tax reform. But until that comes, we shouldn't be raising taxes. We shouldn't be raising taxes in this type of an economy where we've got as many people unemployed as we do, where we've got sluggish economic growth, and we certainly shouldn't be punishing family farmers, ranchers, and small business people with this, what is a punitive, just a punitive death tax proposal coming out of the Democrats in the plan that we're about to vote on at 4 o'clock. And I would yield to our colleague from Wyoming, who is here and, again, represents a state much like mine and much like the senator from Kansas, who has a lot of people who would be impacted by this draconian tax.
Well, Mr. President, just to follow up on that, because clearly in the great state of Wyoming, lots of farmers, lots of ranchers. It is our heritage, it is our economy, it is our future. And many people, and we talked a little bit about that, just to keep these operations going. Actually, some of them have a job in town, so they can make enough money to help pay the mortgage, keep things going, but the price of land continues to go up, and on paper they may have quite a bit of resources here. So to think that we are in the next hour going to vote on a proposal by the Democrats to bring back the death tax is something that should be a surprise to all Americans. And it's farmers, it's ranchers, it's also small business owners. I think of the movie theater owner in Casper, who, known for over 20 years, operated on him, fixed his ankle when he broke it, and he started with one small theater. He was the guy taking tickets, making the popcorn. Other people near him helped out, made it all work, expanded to a second movie theater, and then again and again. And, you know, he built this building. He built those buildings. He built the business. He made it work. He was there early. He was there late. He was there with a broom. When I hear the president say, if you have a business, you didn't build it, someone else did, I would ask the president to come to Casper, Wyoming, to meet the business owners there, to meet the guy that has the dry cleaner, to meet the florist, to meet the person with the car wash, and to meet this owner of the movie theaters, and then go around the community in the outskirts of the area to take a look in rural Wyoming at the ranchers and the farmers and hear their stories, hear their life work, hear what they have put together. And now to see a proposal on the floor of the United States Senate that says, we don't care what you did, how hard you worked, what the impact is going to be on leaving this legacy to your family. We are going to bring back the death tax, and we are coming for you. It is something that the people back home in all of rural America, and I would think in many, many places around the country, would found shocking, astonishing, and very sad as a commentary of what role Washington and government is trying to impose upon their lives. To take these levels of taxation to much higher levels, where death tax hits at $1 million and at 55% at that level, down from where we are now, where it's at $5 million in index for inflation because we see inflation, and a maximum of 35%. I'm astonished that people would actually consider voting for that, but yet that's what the Senate Majority Leader has been proposing, and that's what we're going to vote on within the next hour. It's interesting. I was driving through Hot Springs County, Thermopolis, Wyoming area, a couple of years ago, talking to a farmer who had just gotten out of it. He said, you know, I could fight the weather or I could fight the government, but I couldn't fight both. And he got out of it. A lot of families haven't gotten out of it, and they continue. And now, once again, the heavy hand of government comes with this crushing blow in wanting to raise this sort of tax on families all across the country, people who have really built their own businesses, in spite of what the President may say. These are the people that made this happen. You know, after the President's comments last week, I was in Thermopolis for a reunion, a class reunion over the weekend. They have all the different classes come together, big picnic and cookout in the park. My mother-in-law, Jerry, is a member of the class that graduated quite a few years ago. It was her reunion as well. We were talking about the family bakery that she had worked at as a little girl. The family actually lived above the bakery. They got their food from the bakery because they ate what didn't get sold. They worked every day, talked about her father working so very early in the morning through the day. For lunch, she walked home from school to be able to eat at the bakery. That's a family that built that business. So I talked about her, and I said, well, who else worked there? And then she started to run through the names of the people in the family that built and contributed to this bakery business. It's called the Wigwam in Thermopolis, Wyoming. And she talked about Sonny had worked there. You know, there are a lot of businesses and a lot of farms and a lot of ranches. I see my friend and colleague from Kansas here, where there was a Sonny who worked on that farm or on that ranch. I said, who else worked there in the bakery? She said, well, Shorty worked there too. You know, I think every community has a Shorty that worked in a business that made something happen. They said, who else? And she said, Sandy. And I know there's a Sandy in every community, and yet the President thinks they didn't do anything. I said, who else? And she said, well, Smokey. I mean, you know, we got all these different names of people in the family who made this business, put it together, build it. Those are the people that made this business. Those are the people that the President seems to have forgotten or never met in the first place. Those are the people that built the businesses of this country. It wasn't somebody else. It was them, whose parents worked hard, got up early, the kids worked there. Everyone in the family participated. Everyone contributed. And every community in this country has someone like that. And now to see the Democrats coming forth with a proposal that says you may have built a business, well, they may not believe that that family actually built the business, and we just want to tax you more when the person that really put the equity, the sweat equity into it, dies. Family end up maybe having to sell, as we've heard from the senator from Kansas and South Dakota and North Dakota. And why? Well, a lot of it is because this institution can't control the spending, so they're always looking for new ways to tax other people. The problem is not that we're taxed too little, it's that we spend too much in this institution. Congress spends too much, and the President always seems to find another way to spend more money. That's what we see, continuing to look for ways to find money to then spend. Borrow, spend, grow government bigger and bigger. That's not what built this country. That's not what made this country great. There are families, ranches, farms, small businesses all across this country with the people, through their hard work, their dedication, their commitment, getting up in the early in the morning, working all day long, working well into the evening. And I would ask my friend and colleague from Kansas, I'm sure that you can think of families and picture, you can close your eyes and picture those families where folks actually got up before sunrise and worked through the end of the day and after the sun goes down to build something, to make something of themselves, of their family and their community, to contribute to the community. And now we see government with its heavy hand coming to say, death tax is here, we want to raise the death tax, and we're coming for you.
Well, I certainly thank the senator from Wyoming for his comments. It is a reminder. Those of us who had the privilege of growing up in small-town America, we know those names that the senator from Wyoming indicated. And it's one of the advantages of that small-town life is you